Yo, it's me, Nugget. I'm back with another tutorial. I've seen a lot of people struggling with the basics of ksEditor, and I've realized there's not really a solid tutorial for people to know the basics of ksEditor and how to texture a car and what the shaders mean and all of that. So that's what I'm going to be covering today. So I'm going to add timestamps on the screen for different parts in case you already know some parts of ksEditor but are struggling with one thing. So I'm going to put those up there and then you can skip ahead if need be. But first place, what is ksEditor and how do you know when to use it? So basically ksEditor is the way that you take a model from something like 3ds Max and you add it into game, but in that process, in between 3ds Max or Blender or whatever, you have a 3D model and you have your textures, and it needs to get in game, and it needs shaders, and the game needs to know how to handle all these textures and how shiny it should be and how it should reflect and all of that. And you have to do all of that manually because ksEditor and the engine that Assetto Corsa uses does not accept gloss maps or specular maps or roughless maps or any kind of PBR or anything that a normal game engine such as Unity would accept to handle all of that for you. So we have to do it all manually, but that's not a problem because the pipeline that Kunos has given us is very solid and it's super easy to do. So that's what I'm going to walk you through right now. So first things first is how do you find ksEditor? Where is it? What is it? So if you go to your Assetto Corsa directory folder, you'll see here, this is where your Assetto Corsa exe is, where it's installed. And in here, if you go to the SDK folder, and then you go to editor, that's where ksEditor is. There's also modded versions of ksEditor or ksEditor v6 that you can also get. It also works, but it is prone to crashes sometimes. So I use the basic one. It's up to preference really. But we're going to open this. Now, my ksEditor will look a little different than yours because I have some settings set in the config folder. In the editor folder, I changed the resolution, so I have it higher resolution so it's wider. You can go and change that, and the first thing you're going to do here is you're going to load your FBX. So you go File, Open FBX, and then you're going to go to your car, wherever the model is. I always suggest putting it in an unpacked folder, in the folder where you're going to put your car, just so it's easier to save and navigate to textures and all of that. So I always put the FBX next to the textures in the unpacked folder. That's how I recommend you do it. So I'm going to open my FBX here. There you go. It might take some time depending on how big your car is. So first things first, controls. It's the arrow keys. It's not WASD. It's the arrow keys to move around, forward, backward, left, and right. And it's if you click and hold the mouse, you can move your camera. And if you hold control, it'll make you go super fast. You will never need to use that unless you're making tracks. And if you hold shift, you go slow. And that's basically all the controls. But yeah, you're going to start underneath your car here. It always starts the camera at the origin. This is a good indicator to know the scale of your car, because if I load another car here, actually speaking of loading another car, if you make a change to your FBX, you cannot just hit open FBX, because if you hit open FBX, it'll load another car into the same scene. It won't reload it. So you actually have to hit the restart editor button. So I'm gonna load my IS300 here. It may say not responding if it takes a while, because this is a bigger FBX. There you go. So you can see the wheels. You'll always be able to see the wheels or at least most of the time, unless you have like a super wide car, but you probably don't have a car that wide. You'll usually be able to see the wheels. So you can see that that's a good indicator of knowing if the scale you exported the car at is correct, because you'll be able to see basically as soon as you load it. So first thing you're going to do, everything's going to be black and white. If this is your first time loading ksEditor, everything is going to be in black and white, and it's going to be foggy. God knows why Kunos decided to make this the default option for ksEditor. But what you're going to do is you're going to go to illumination here, and then down here is where you're going to load 3 clear or mid clouds or light clouds or whatever, anything other than fog. And you're going to hit load weather, and you're going to select default, because on as a default it's on black and white, but you want default, and then you load that, and then that should make it not black and white and foggy. And you're actually going to go to utilities and then data editor here, and then you can set the default so it always loads as 3 clear and as default, and then you just hit save, and then it should always load those as the defaults. So starting off here, setting up materials. Basically this step actually doesn't take place in ksEditor, it takes place in whatever 3D program you're using. So I've already set up my materials. What I mean by setting up materials is that if you want 2 things to have a different texture, this is not exactly a good example because it uses 1 texture for the entire boat. But if you want, say, the base of the boat, yes, I know I'm using a boat, not a car, leave me be. If you want the texture of your boat, the inside of your boat, to be a different color or texture than the outside of your boat, you have to make sure that they're 2 different materials. So you need to make sure that one is a different material than the other. And if you have something like a multi-material, there you go. So if you have something like this, it's just going to be clear for now. It's fine. If you have a multi-material like that, where this element is assigned a different material than this element, you need to be careful, because that will actually create a separate object in ksEditor. It automatically separates them by material. So this will be airboat paint sub 1, and then this will be airboat paint. So there's no point in using multi-materials to optimize your mesh, because you have to separate by material anyways. So moving on, I will show you around the UI now. So first things first, I'm going to select a object here. So I'm going to right click, and you can see what I selected is being highlighted in purple. So I'll do that again. Now I've selected the base of the boat, and now I've selected the paint of the boat. You can see on the left here, this is really similar to the scene explorer that you'll see in 3ds Max. And it's basically, these are objects, and you can scroll through them just like this, and they'll be selected in the scene, or you can select them from the 3D viewer here. So I'm going to start off by selecting the paint of my boat, and I'm going to go to the materials tab, which is up here at the top left. And this is the materials tab. This is probably the most important part of ksEditor. And here you can change your textures, the shader values, different shaders, and all of that. It's very important. I'm going to go through most of them at least and tell you what they all do. So let's say you want to add a texture to something. In the materials tab, you will have different options here, but starting from scratch, you will always be on ks per pixel, which is just the most basic shader. It's basically just a texture with like a couple of options. It's not that many options. So I will get back to all these values in a minute, but first things first, we just want to add a texture. So you'll see here, there is no diffuse here. And the diffuse is basically the color base texture of the object. So if you want to make a leather seat, you're going to put the leather texture or color map or diffuse on the diffuse slot. So here I'm going to add my boat diffuse. And you can see even after the texture was added, it's still pitch black. This is normal. Your car will be pitch black because we have to add shaders first. First things first, we have ksAmbient. ksAmbient is basically how bright it is at all times, regardless of where the sun is or how the sun is shining on it. It's the ambient brightness of the material. So right now I'm going to set this to 0.5, and you can see immediately it's made it show up, and you can see the texture there. You can see that it's green. However, I'm going to change the direction of the sunlight here, and you can see that the sun is not shining on the car. So that's when we get to ks diffuse. And the diffuse is basically how much the sun diffuses on an object. So the higher it is, the brighter it will be when sunlight hits it. So if I put it to 0.1, you can see it's only shining a little bit. And if I put it to 1, you can see it's shining a lot. So I'm gonna put this right about in the middle. I'm gonna put it to 0.5. I don't need something crazy. And you can see here, that's looking better, but it kind of looks like Play-Doh. We want a little bit of shine on it, a little bit of shine on the paint here. So that's when we get to specular and specular exp. And these two usually go together, but they do different things. So I'll put an image on the screen right now so you guys know what specular highlights are, because ks specular and ks specular exp handle those specular highlights, and they allow you to change how they look. So ks specular here affects how bright the specular highlights are, and ks specular exp affects how well the specular highlights are diffused. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to put this here. I'm going to put this at 0.5 again. And you can see now we have specular highlights, but they're super diffused, right? They're not sharp at all. And that's what specular exp handles. It handles basically how sharp the specular highlights are. So if I put this to 10, now you can see it's less sharp. And if I put this to something like 100, now you can see it's super sharp. So you can start to see how these shader values super important at how good your car looks, how good a material looks, basically all of that. So moving on, I'm actually going to change the shader because I want to add a normal map to this. So if you want to add a normal map, what you're going to do is you're going to go to per pixel NM, and you can see it will screw up the way your car looks here. So most cars in the texture folders will have a flat NM, a flat normal map. And normal maps basically allow for the mimicking of geometry without that geometry actually being there. So it allows for things such as this grill here to be there, and it makes it look like that's modeled in, but it's actually not. And it also allows for extra detail if you need something like this texture or the wood texture here. It allows for that extra detail, and it really helps bring your texture to life. So I want to add a normal map, so I'm going to go to TX normal, which is where the normal map slot goes, and I'm going to add my normal map. And there, now you can see not much has changed on this specific material because it's a paint. It's going to be flat. But if I go to the wood here, and if I add my texture, change it to per pixel NM, add my normal map, and then if I give it a couple shaders, let's say 0.2, 0.2, and then I'm going to say 0.5 and 25. Now you can see we do have that normal map on the wood, giving it a little bit of texture. Now, moving back onto the paint of the boat. So we have 3 new values here that you need to worry about. You have Fresnel max level, you have Fresnel EXP, and Fresnel C. These all handle reflections and how reflective an object is. We're actually going to work from the bottom up here, and I'll show you why. So Fresnel max level is basically the overall how reflective an object is. So if I make this something like 0.1, you can see immediately that we do have reflections here. And if I make it something like 0.5, you can see it almost becomes chrome-like. Now, we don't really want this. It's a little too chrome. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to go to Fresnel EXP. Now this handles basically the exposure of the reflections. So it kind of changes the way that you're looking at it. So we're going to make this around what the recommended option is, which is around 3.5. And you can see that immediately makes it look a little bit better because it's not shiny all around, super unrealistic, super cartoony. And then we're going to go to Fresnel C here, which is basically the ambient reflections. So it's not affected really by Fresnel EXP. It's sort of the ambient reflections. So this is helpful for things in an interior where the sun doesn't really necessarily shine on it. So it's very easy to go overboard with this. You can see it's stronger than Fresnel max level. So we're gonna just put this at something low, like 0.07. So now we have our paint. This isn't necessarily what a boat would look like, but this is something along the lines of what paint would look like in terms of reflections. So if you want to do these reflections, but you don't have a normal map, you can use the per pixel reflection shader here, and that will allow you to access all of these values without using a normal map. But I always use a normal map. It doesn't really change that much if you do. So let's say I want a seat to be leather. I'm going to go to per pixel NM because I have a normal map, and I also have my diffuse here. I'm going to add some shader values. It doesn't really matter what I add here. I'm going to add just something basic that I can use. And you can already see here, but wait a second, that doesn't look right. And this has to do with the tiling of your normal map. Basically, your normal map is going to be stretched across your entire texture without repeating, and this is obviously not a good thing at all. And so there is a very easy solution for this. It's called per pixel NM UV molt. And now you can see here we have 2 new values here. There's diffuse molt and normal molt. This is basically controls the tiling. So if I were to make these higher values, you can see that it instantly looks better because it is tiling, it is repeating these textures across the UV map of my seat. So I'm going to put this at something like 100. It's a little too high. I'm going to put it at like 50. That's better. So now you can see that's how you would want to tile something such as leather or carbon fiber or anything. And there's also a way to do this with per pixel multimap. I cover multimap in my paint shop tutorial. This is if you have a AO, so I would follow probably Mamiya Motors AO tutorial if you need help with that, and then you can go here. I always recommend using multimap over something like reflection or per pixel NM because it always gives better results and makes everything look nicer. But if you want to tile a normal map over your AO, there is a multimap NM detail, and then you can see there's a normal detail slot added where you put the normal map for your TX detail, which is obviously tiled. I explained that in the tutorial, but for now we're just going to use UV molt. So moving on, I'm going to show you glass, because glass is a very specific thing. So I'm going to make this fence here. This is normally a fence, but I'm going to make it into glass just to show you what you should be doing. So first things first, you need a glass texture. Now usually this is a texture. Here I'm going to show you a texture. It doesn't have to be something big, but preferably it's something that has a gray alpha. Now what that means is basically, you can see here, I have a gray alpha, and if I hide that, it's just black. It doesn't matter what color you choose, unless you have a alpha that's more white than gray. What I mean by that is basically the alpha controls the transparency of your image. So if I paint this white, you can see now it comes black. And this works the same way in ksEditor. So I will show you now a glass texture. You can see here I have a whiter alpha, and I also have a darker overall image here. And this basically allows you to tint the glass, and it also controls the transparency of the glass. And I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to set up basic shaders here. And I'm going to add my glass texture. Now you can see, once I've done this, it's not see-through. So how do you make it see-through? You're going to go to blend mode here, and you can see default it's opaque, but you're going to make it alpha blend, and then that makes it see-through. So now you can see it is see-through, but what happened to the objects that are behind it? I have a cage here, I have a prop here. What happened to them? You're going to go down here, the object properties tab in the bottom left, and you're going to find the box that says is transparent, and as default it'll be false, but you're going to set that to be true. And there you go. Now you have working glass that is transparent. Another thing I forgot to mention, the object properties here is dependent on object, obviously. It might seem obvious, but it's not obvious. So if you have separate meshes, say your windscreen is a different mesh than your windows, you'll have to set each one of them transparent separately. So I'm gonna have to set this because this is a different object than this, and I'll have to set them both to be transparent. And then that fixes the problem where one is transparent and the other isn't. So you might be wondering, what's that alpha test thing? You're not going to be using that for glass, but if you have a decal, that needs to be cut out. So for example here, I'm going to choose this registration card here. So I will choose, here you go. You can see it has this awful gray box. Now we don't like that. We don't want a gray box. So I'm going to change it to alpha blend, right? That must be the right option. And then I'm gonna make it transparent. Well, yes, that could work, but sometimes this does tend to cast shadows. So another option that we like to use is we use the alpha test, and this basically changes anything that's black on the alpha is cut out instead of blended. And this is really helpful for decals like this, where it's just a cutout, instead of decals and textures like this, where it's more of a gray sort of alpha. And that's basically what you're going to be using. Okay, so let's say you just want to get your car into game. First things first, you're going to want to save your persistence. So what I mean by that is the persistence is basically the way that the game handles the saving of these textures in and shaders and all the values you set in ksEditor. So if you reload the model and come back right now without saving the persistence, you'll lose all the work you did. So make sure you save persistence. It doesn't autosave, so you have to go and do that. And then that, once you save that, will create an INI with the same name as your FBX, and this is the persistence, and you can see it saves all the values here. So make sure you do that. Do it often. ksEditor is pretty stable. It doesn't really crash, but when it does, you'll be pretty sad if you lose all your work. Okay, so once you've saved your persistence, if you want to save your car, you're gonna hit save KN5, save car, and I'm going to save this as airboat.kn5. And oops, looks like there's a problem. Yeah, you're gonna run into this. This error happens here. It tells you what it is. It says an error null texture on material, and then it tells you the texture and the texture slot. So I'm gonna have a bunch of these because I didn't finish, as an example to show you. So if you go to the materials tab in the bottom left, it shows you which materials here have the null texture, which is no texture. And it'll throw an error every time you save your KN5, and it won't save the KN5. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm going to add all of these textures, and then I'll get back to you when I do that. Okay, so I've just added all the textures, and now I'm going to go save my persistence, and I'm going to save my KN5. So I'm going to go and I'm going to save it as airboat.kn5. And give it a minute, and then it'll say KN5 saved. And then you can see when you go to your folder, it saves it as a KN5. And you should be able to open this in Content Manager Showroom. Well, if you set your logs correctly. There you go. And now you can see I have it in Showroom. And you're good to go. So as you can see, it's not that hard to do. You can figure it out through intuition. It's a very steep learning curve at the beginning. But yeah, I recommend you go try out shaders. You just mess about. It's pretty intuitive. You can figure out what each one does, what each shader value does, and the best situations in which to use them, in which to use certain values. And if you ever struggle with anything, feel free, go in Content Manager, go to a car you like. Say, I like this car, right? And I like the shaders they used for the paint. You can look at the car paint shaders. You can see what they used, and you can work on that. And you can also view the textures they used. You can see how they did all of that. So just mess around, just play around, figure it out. Try different shaders and you'll be good to go. It's not that hard. If you have any questions, add them to the comments or DM me on Discord or mention me in my Discord or whatever. And I'll be sure to help you. Or I'll make another tutorial covering these topics if enough people struggle with it. And yeah, that's basically it. I don't have an outro, so I'm just gonna hop out. Adios.